Hey everyone, this one's going to be a bit different for me, I think. So I just had a conversation with Jack Poulson, which I have coming up for you today, and I'm going to tell you Jack's background really quickly and why the name might ring a bell if you follow this kind of stuff. And I'm saying it quickly because Jack does not want to be defined or kind of hemmed in by his personal story or the label of whistleblower. I think that's actually kind of awesome and admirable, and I want to really respect it because Jack, at this point, and now for several years, is just a kind of no BS investigative journalist who makes it his mission to research and publish and investigate how our data flows into the hands of corporations and governments and military organizations, etc. So the quick story is that Jack was working for Google when he had ethical concerns about working on a project that was basically customizing Google search results for the Chinese market and maybe more. The concerns were things like if a user in China was Googling something, maybe searching for human rights or other organizations or something like that, would Google kind of take this data and hand over that user's data to police forces or something, or the government in China, or return certain results to the user which were maybe just approved by the Chinese government. So Jack had problems with that, and he eventually refused to work on it and became what the media loves to call, a whistleblower of this kind of stuff. And he set out on his own then and started an organization and an amazing website called Tech Inquiry to basically be a watchdog journalist organization like I described. And you're going to hear him walk through a recent investigation on the claims of a certain Zionist group which claimed to be using facial recognition programs and technology to identify pro-Palestine protesters and then hand that information over to the US government in order to help deport pro-justice non-citizens at these protests. A desire which has been endlessly expressed now by many in the Trump administration. And of course, the previous administration wasn't so fond of those protesters either. So anyway, that's Jack Poulson. And I think it's a really hugely important thing to be aware of and discuss that we're going to be talking about. But I know it can be a bit technical, and you're going to hear a ton of names of programs and companies and relationships with these companies and stuff that you really don't have to keep track of in that level of detail. That's Jack's job. And we should be all really glad that he's doing it. So instead, I kind of wanted to do something a bit different here in the opening, and I'm actually going to try to draw something because I had some fun with this. And I think this could all be a bit of a whirlwind, the conversation, but I do think this is really important. And there's a stretch in our conversation where Jack does walk through this, what I'm going to try to sort of draw with language, but I thought it might be fun and helpful to have a little visualization in mind. At least it's helpful for me to try to do it. I was trying to edit during that part with logos and arrows and things he was talking about, but honestly, I think it's just more confusing than just trying to talk about sort of the overall general philosophy and structure first. So the first thing I want to do in this whole conversation about data and privacy and commercial companies and militaries and foreign governments and all this kind of stuff is to underline something that I hit on in the interview a few times. It's that there really is, I think, a very important ethical conversation and a real ethical dilemma to discuss here. And I remember the first time I encountered it. I don't remember exactly where, but it was before smartphones were really widely adopted and we all, started putting a tracking device in our own pockets. By the way, it's just crazy how fast all of this stuff moves. I don't know your age, you watching this right now, but I'm sure people around my generation or a bit before or after have had the experience of meeting someone maybe just 5 years older or younger and then realizing, that small gap like drastically changes the specific technology which we encountered maybe in our formative teenage years or college or anything. And the differences in those technological differences is like huge. And I mean, I'm talking about like really specific things in technology which have been studied and looked at, like the difference in society when Facebook introduced the like button versus the poke button or action or whatever it was called. It's like that level of detail, It's not just like, did a computer exist or not? It's minute stuff that has these huge implications. So anyway, I'm 42, so I graduated university in 2004. And so this was around the time of actual, trackpads on laptops were first being introduced, using your finger to move the mouse. And the smartphone really wasn't widely adopted until maybe 2010 or so. In fact, the iPhone was first introduced in 2007. So I was in this little window. And so anyway, I remember the thought experiment with this trackpad. And it was like, okay, there's this possible thing that could happen where if your laptop was keeping track of your finger's behavior over time, what if it could detect slight changes that you yourself were not aware of? Maybe it had been tracking exactly how accurate you were in moving the mouse, exactly where you wanted it over time, and it noticed that you were, starting to get a tiny bit slower or miss by a millimeter to the right every time, and this was a new kind of sudden thing in you that you hadn't noticed. Or maybe it was just detecting like the very slightest tremor and quiver in your finger movement. And again, you weren't consciously aware of any of it. So what if, let's say, Microsoft had been keeping an eye on this kind of thing? Just they were automatically doing it. And they had a concern that, maybe this tremor could be an early sign of some terrible neurological disease that would only get worse if you didn't do something. Would you want Microsoft to maybe just have a pop-up appear on your screen that was like, hey, we've noticed some potentially troubling tremors in your finger lately. No need for alarm, but we recommend that you go to a doctor and have them check it out. It could be a potential problem. Would you want that? I mean, it could potentially save your life, something so simple. But of course, for all that to have happened, either Microsoft would have been just tracking all of this information without your knowledge, or you would have had to agree to let them monitor your finger movements at some earlier point and sign or agree to some terms and conditions, as if anyone reads that stuff. And so immediately we have this interesting ethical dilemma about a pretty massive amount of trust to keep that data safe wherever they're storing it and to not abuse it directly. Because even just simple finger tracking data, of course, the keys themselves as well, but just the tracking data could potentially be used to know just about everything someone is doing online if you just track it right. It just brings up an entire privacy versus safety and security concern that I think is really quite real. And again, that was like the mid-2000s. In the next 2 decades, this little ethical dilemma exploded into just an insane level of potential data, which all carries this same embedded dilemma about security and safety versus abuse and silencing and stifling, or, of course, literal military or police targeting. I think everyone can appreciate that conversation without getting too deep into the details or getting lost in conspiracy theories or anything. But I do think getting into the weeds a bit here, as Jack does as well, is really worthwhile. So, all right, I'm going to draw an analogy. It's actually one that Jack gives me in the talk. So we're going to start here. So here is a house. This is a house. And in this house is you. And it's basically the place, think of it as the place where all of your data, or all the data about you, is created. So this is data in here. And it's data about you. So I'll just whatever, about you. And this is really everything. So of course, your geolocation, where you are in the world, which is timestamped to, your medical history, your political thoughts, and your relationships, your daily schedule, where you go, all that stuff, your travel history, every website you visit, what you buy and for how much, and every photo you've taken or been in. I mean, really stretch your mind here, because in this house, I want you to think of something really minute, like the specific sidewalk you were on at a specific minute in a specific city, and if you were smiling at that specific moment because you happened to be caught in the background of a selfie that a tourist was taking 15 feet away from you, who then uploaded it to social media. I'm talking of like just that level of just data, like even hypothetical data. This is the data about you. And of course, in this data is also the contours of your face in order to positively identify you from cameras that can be surprisingly far away. Okay, so that's this. This is the house. And now I'm going to put three, let's see what colors to use here. I'm going to put three general categories here. Think of these like categories like motivations. So there's a thing over here. We'll do a dollar sign here. This is the motivation to want to sell you stuff, products or services, or I don't know, services of convenience. And then another motivation here, of course, would be a motivation to silence you. This could mean jail, scare, just intimidate you, or of course, kill you. And then let's do this one over here. This is a motivation to protect you, keep you safe, keep you secure. Like good stuff is over there. Maybe, of course, if your finger is quivering, they want to send you to a doctor because they're genuinely worried about you. And so that's kind of it for the potential motivations. And notice already, before we get our minds too far, that these three bubbles are not so clean. For example, and these aren't companies, these aren't entities, these are motivations. But if you think of a specific company or a government or something, of course it can exist in all three of these. They're not locked in to any one place. So, and here's the data. So what I asked Jack to do is really describe the ways in which these motivations, which of course would all want to get in here and find these things out, how they do it. And he describes that as kind of a front door and a back door. So let me add a door. The back door is here and it's locked, right? You could do a keyhole, sort of. And the front door over here. The front door is open. You've opened it. Okay, so first let's talk about the back door, because I think it's kind of easier to understand. And so in the back door, what I do, this gray one here, the back door is basically, what he calls wiretapping. And this, I think, is pretty easy to understand. It's basically the modern equivalent of someone, putting a bug under your desk, that old spy stuff, in order to listen privately to all your conversations. It's basically just that. The guy's in the van listening into the room or the scene to gather information. And in the modern context, that's basically just, these guys bugging the house. It could be done through, U.S. government just demanding or taking all the data from something like Verizon servers, which include all the phone calls that went through their networks, all geolocated with durations of the call. This is, of course, what Edward Snowden revealed was happening famously. So imagine, of course, there's a key to get into this as well. So I'll do it this way, because there's an arrow basically of getting in through the back door with this key. So if a government just goes directly and is like, hey, we need all the data and we're just going to go in and get it. We'll go in, Verizon, we're demanding you give it to us. We'll take it from you. And that's kind of it. So, other forms of this backdoor that Jack brings up is something like a police department getting a warrant or not. Of course, the warrant is the key or not to take your phone or your laptop during an investigation, and just pulling off an iCloud backup and getting direct access to whatever they want in it, whether that's WhatsApp messages or website histories or whatever. This backdoor, obviously would be accessed mostly by people with these motivations, right? A lot of these motivations of wanting to silence and kill you, but of course it could also be people who want to protect you. It's up to us to debate that. And then, of course, if it's with people with these motivations, this person might be in a foreign country or a foreign citizen, so there might not be a key or not. And this is, of course, what Jack was worried about Google building a backdoor for China to get to their own citizens in ways that he was not comfortable with. So I think that one's fairly easy to understand. But I just want to actually put another layer to add to this flow, what I just described, because we also have to kind of put another player in here, because this data down here is really a mess. It's just ones and zeros all over the place, right? There's just so much data. And so there are tons of companies, and you'll hear some of these names from Jack, but I think it's important to just understand the concepts here again. There are companies whose mission and work it is to basically try to clean up and present this data or maybe fuse it together in such a way that their buyers, whoever they are at these other layers, might be able to access it or use it, a little bit more. And so there's companies here, they're not on any side of this thing, but maybe like, data fusion companies. Just think of it as data cleanup. There's data cleanup companies, and they make tons and tons of money because they're taking this mess and making it usable for then buyers to then buy it. This might be data fusion companies, which there's a ton of, are trying to stitch together maybe data that they get from your fitness app and your travel app and your geolocation and your dating app and whatever else it is, and stitch it together in such a way to make a clean, nice profile package that's searchable like a dashboard for you. So think of it like that. So there's companies here that usually it's not the government just getting the ones and zeros. They need someone to hire someone or to put out a contract to help them sift through it. So I think for this, most entities, like I said, would be engaging in this, even if they're benevolent or nefarious or whatever, we all argue about whatever. It'd be hard, they come from these motivations. It would be hard to think of maybe a profit motive to get in here, although of course they would love to do it. It would probably be a big scandal if some private company was just hacking or working with Verizon directly to get your data. I assume it's not that common. But the front door, and I think this one is much more troublesome and much more interesting to think about. So the front door is basically the door that we have consented to opening. So let me just draw us to remind us that we opened this one. But I'm putting consented in quotes there because I think it's really a pretty ridiculous form of consenting. There was a documentary made in, I think, 2013 called Terms and Conditions May Apply that I'll link to for anyone interested in that kind of thing that started to open the conversation about this with maybe taking a closer look at exactly what we're all agreeing to when we click agree on all those pop-ups. But in any case, this front door is ostensibly public, right? So it's the data that the apps on our phones have access to when we install them, or the cookies on websites that we accept or are forced to accept, or even public data from something like a surveillance camera on the street or in a gas station security camera. All that can get a little fuzzy, right? If it's really a front door or not. Was walking down the street or going to a public park really a form of tacit consent for the data to be accessed by this group or any of these motivations? Anyway, it's kind of a legal question that I'm not equipped to answer fully, but let's be a bit more simple here. So let me first just draw the arrow. Since this is a front door, basically the arrow goes like this, right? Like we sent it this way. Apps, anything public, in quotes here. All right. So let's imagine just a simple company. Let's imagine there's a company, and I'm not going to put them in any of these things, but that makes something simple, like let's say a heart-shaped picture frame or whatever. All right, something kind of silly. Heart-shaped picture frame, that's there. And they think this product is, cool, and they want to sell it to people. And they have a simple advertisement that they've made, like a little, picture that displays it. And, this is a flower I'm trying to do now. It's an ad that links to other online stores where they might have other little gifts like teddy bears and flowers, etc. Okay, so where do they want this advertisement to appear? And perhaps you're already thinking that this is maybe a potential Valentine's Day gift, and so maybe a pretty crummy last-minute one at that. So immediately, perhaps this advertisement popping up in, Mongolia would be a waste. So maybe first they want to filter it and have the advertisement pop up in nations that actually celebrate Valentine's Day, and that's a start. Maybe it should target men, and maybe it's men who have a pattern of forgetting these days in previous years. Maybe it's men who are of a certain age, etc. You get it. I think we're all familiar with this concept of personalized and targeted advertising at this point. But so here's kind of how it works, at least with one of these particular open door paths. So when you visit a website, or you're maybe playing a game like Candy Crush, and an advertisement is about to be displayed, there's something called a real-time bidding process that takes place. And it literally takes place in like milliseconds. And I told you this stuff was actually technologically kind of crazy. And so it's basically something like this. So imagine like an auction room here. I guess this is like the auction block, and a whole bunch of people are sitting. I don't know how auctions work. These are the people, and this is the auctioneer up here. And it's basically that your data profile, right? There's companies that service this, these data cleanup companies that help the auctioneer give them a bunch of this stuff. But imagine he just starts, this auctioneer has your profile, stuff like age and location, history, medical history, height, relationship status, income level, all that stuff, right? Imagine that's put up for auction. So he holds up this, data profile sheet. And then an auction takes place. And in the auction seats are sitting a ton of companies. And they can all bid. They can all auction on you with a price. And the winning bidder, this is the prize you get, if they win the bid with the highest bid after this auction is complete, gets to show you an advertisement. That's their prize. And so, by the way, these bidding amounts are like fractions of a fraction of a penny. They're tiny. But the auction still happens. Again, in like milliseconds this happens. And so imagine if the profile I just described of that man is up of a certain age and in a relationship and certain life patterns and whatever. It's up for auction, and perhaps this heart-shaped picture frame company gets all excited when they see it. Again, this is all not literal. This is all automated, and they think, hey, that guy whose profile that is might be interested in the ad, and he might click on it. There's a small chance, but a chance, and he might buy something if he goes to it. And so, they hold up their little sign and, they win the bid. They beat everyone else out of the bidding, and then they run up and they collect their prize, which is they get to then show you an ad for a few seconds or whatever it is, whatever YouTube or whoever forces you to do. And then that's it. You do what you do. You'll either buy or you won't buy. And so that kind of thing is happening at like lightning quick speeds behind the scenes all of the time in this insanely wild, data-rich world that we've found ourselves in. And again, the motivation here might be pretty simple, and again, maybe even convenient, right? Like there wasn't a lot of ethical problems with that. Do I need an advertisement for pizza parlors in Paraguay right now? No, but maybe from time to time I could be shown something that is relevant that I actually might like. It could even be a product or a service or a discussion group, who knows? That discussion, by the way, opens up a whole different and I think fun philosophical conversation about advertising and the ethics and the limits of manipulation. And for anyone who wants a really great discussion on that stuff, my third ever episode on the show was called Do I Smell Donuts with David Pizarro, the psychologist. It was about a real Dunkin' Donuts ad campaign where they literally sprayed the smell of donuts and coffee onto public buses with this little like automatic dispenser when the bus was stopping within walking distance of a Dunkin' Donuts. They ran the ad, a real ad on public buses in South Korea. Anyway, it's one of my favorite episodes of my early episodes of all time. So we get into that ethics of all that in this one, or in that one. But the point is, in the process of everything I just walked through, of this data profile at this auction, a tremendous amount of personal data was gathered and aggregated by companies, apps, websites, whatever. Again, the public front door. These are basically sort of referred to as data brokers that work in this space. And again, you'll hear Jack rattle off a bunch of these names and companies and relationships that happen here. And so these data brokers collect and clean and compile this data. And there also is fraud in that space and fraudulent data that happens, and Jack mentions that as well. But then they can sell it on to whoever they like these real-time bidding processes that I just mentioned, or whoever else you can imagine in this space to sell. Because also sitting in these real-time bidding places might be places who are potentially governments who do want to do harm to you or help you, or wherever we argue about that. And here's the part that Jack and his work and his organization is really deeply concerned about. These guys over here in the security or silencing motivation groups. It could be the Department of Defense or the Pentagon. It could be a foreign government if this person happens to be in a place like Somalia and perhaps is also interested in maybe anti-Western political movements or maybe purchased certain books. I mean, you really can let your imagination run pretty wild here with all the potential use cases in these bubbles that are really just beyond anything that George Orwell could have ever imagined. So when you see this picture laid out here, think of if you have, the U.S., that's an American flag kind of, if you have a U.S. agency that's interested in finding and tracking and keeping an eye on certain people, remember, there's companies here cleaning up the data, and they're brokers, and they can get it through the back door, but they don't have to. They could just get it all through the front door, clean it up, and then who are the buyers? Where are they buying from, right? Whether you think they belong in this group or that group, that's a debate. Obviously, we could have many governments, many militaries who want to silence people, who want to help people. We could argue about that all day. But these are the connections that Jack is interested in. Who is the client? Who is buying the data, whether it's at this auction or other ways to acquire it just directly, or who are they hiring to sift through the data and clean it up? Again, this one I think is pretty easy to understand. Snowden really sounded the alarm on, hey, they've unlocked your back door and they're just taking it. Maybe there was a bit of a conversation in society about like, I'm not so sure we should allow that or not. Maybe they should get a warrant. That one is almost a legal question. The front door is the one that really, really is interesting, of who is buying this data. And if we're just clicking around online and living our lives and playing on apps and thinking it's just people trying to sell us stuff and that's its own kind of ethical dilemma about capitalism, okay. But the buyers of this data, I'm not sure many of us think or assume or maybe would be okay with knowing all of the ways in which that sell to us of just give us your data and we'll give you better ads or something actually is being bought by plenty of people who might not want to do you so much good, or even today if they want to do you good, tomorrow they could be a fascist government that wants to target you. So this is the kind of thing that Jack is interested in, shining a light on, being an investigative reporter of, and so hopefully that picture can help you keep your head around this conversation a bit. So please enjoy Jack Poulson and follow his work at Tech Inquiry and enjoy this conversation. Thank you. Give me a little bit of your background and your personal journey, starting, from when you were, I guess, math major and headed in a certain direction in life, taking the job with Google, and then all the way up to sort of those initial protests. Like, how do you sort of, in a nutshell, introduce yourself to a new audience now?
I mean, the honest truth is I try not to. I think that's the trap of veering outside of, what I is the style of journalism I want to do is not overly editorializing and sort of centering myself. I think ideally I am sort of an observer that gets out of the way to the degree to which you can. Obviously, what you cover is always subjective and what you emphasize and the like, but maybe I'm just a little bit burned by some of the aspects of the whistleblower community that I found to be a bit much sometimes, that I'd rather kind of take the opposite tact and just not center myself. But my broader background was computational and applied math, and in fact that was my PhD. But before that, I did aerospace engineering, kind of the computational side of that, particularly structural dynamics, which is broadly speaking studying the vibrations of materials. So I was in a lab that built software to, for example, make cars quieter by modeling their vibrations, and that has implications for example, satellites, not vibrating too much. And over time, I switched into broader physics simulation and what you might describe as simulating physics on kind of government supercomputers. And so I had like an internship in a national lab, never had a clearance or anything like that. I was at Argonne up in Chicago, just doing open source software stuff. And ended up as an assistant professor first at Georgia Tech and then at Stanford. And I think Stanford kind of broke me
Hmm.
of academia.
Hmm.
In the I'll put it this way: one of my first meetings there was a cocktail party with John Hennessy, I think he was the um, provost or chairman. I
Hmm.
forget the formal title of Stanford at the time. He then became chairman of Alphabet later. And right as I get to this sort of mansion that he's hosting this cocktail party, and the question I'm asked is, well, have you bought a house yet? And I'm thinking, like, how the hell do you buy a house in Palo Alto for, multiple $1 million on like a professor's salary?
Yeah.
And you get the sense that like you're supposed to also be a tech executive at the
Hmm.
same time. And that's kind of the vibes of what it means to climb the social hierarchy. And I worked on DARPA contracts as a professor. For example, I was on this project, I want to say in 2013 called X Data, which you can Google around. It was basically how does the Pentagon start doing open source analytics work?
Yeah.
And next door, I think under the exact same program manager, a guy named Chris White, who ended up at Microsoft, was a program called Memex, which takes its name from this very famous essay from Vannevar Bush, who was the co-founder of Raytheon and
Hmm.
a kind of famous public intellectual, um, that was kind of hypothesizing, what we would now just refer to as a computer. And so Memex was an interesting project because it was very tied into US intelligence, particularly the FBI. Um, and one of the things that it did was index all of the onion sites on Tor
Hmm.
and then try to use cell phone location tracking data or I shouldn't say necessarily cell phone location data, but location data to de-anonymize sex trafficking
Hmm.
in the United States, which was a very popular way to kind of sell surveillance at the time,
Yeah.
the Obama administration. Um, and anyway, so I kind of just didn't
Yeah.
want to do that work. Like I didn't want to be involved in or to be kind of compelled into defense work. I wanted to like write open source software. I wanted to um, have all of my publications be open access.
Hmm.
And the field I was in didn't really respect that. And
Yeah.
at one point, maybe one of the more aggressive stances I took is I just started refusing editorial assignments as a new assistant professor to volunteer, my taxpayer subsidized labor towards, closed access publications owned by companies like Elsevier.
Hmm.
And I got a knock on my door from one of my tenure committee members, and they let me know you can't do that. You'll be denied tenure if you don't reverse that stance.
Yeah.
So I kind of gave them the middle finger effectively and moved across the street, as they say, to Google.
Yeah.
Um, and, I guess the way I've probably said it a few times is if you have kind of ethical disagreements with Stanford, you're pretty guaranteed to have some ethical disagreements with, $1 trillion company like Google. And that, that's indeed what happened.
Yeah.
Um,
I could even pause you there because I'll tell the Google story in the upfront just as like where people may have known you. But I love sort of your intro of not wanting to be like penned in or defined by this whistleblower label or story, and to break apart and just and operate as best as you can as an objective journalist. But I just wanted to like, because there was a lot in there and I knew some of the words because
yeah.
I think before I jump into like, I'm going to start with a question about the Wrath of Zion because I think that's probably the most like buzzy thing that you've recently done, and I want to know more about it. But before I ask it, I want to just like peg something that you just sort of walked through quickly there. Tor, I remember Tor. It was like supposed to be this totally untraceable, anonymous web interface for the dark web. I remember all these memes of like an iceberg and like, oh, this is the web you interface with, but there's this dark web and all this really shady stuff down is happening in there. Like you can hire assassins or drug deals, like all kinds of stuff in the dark web. And I think some of it was true to a degree. Some of it was probably bullshit, but Tor was the way you were supposed to access this. And like I just want to acknowledge before we get into all these things, that there is a genuine ethical dilemma conversation to be had here about privacy and security and all this kind of stuff. And I've saved it for the end of our conversation. But I just want to peg that, like what you said there about like child sex trafficking. It's like if you're sitting in a server somewhere and there's this principle of free expression and privacy, and you shouldn't be, digging around without, I don't know, warrants or whatever into like a server somewhere in Palo Alto or something. But you could, for a high degree of certainty that if you go in there and connect a bunch of ones and zeros, you might be violating privacy, but you might be saving a child somewhere from child trafficking. And I just want to peg that as a legitimate ethical dilemma on the table that I think we don't have as a society anymore. Obviously, Edward Snowden, the king of all the whistleblowers, dumped this on everyone's desk. You followed sort of the footsteps of that in a minor way, and I respect your decision to not want to be penned in by it and just do good work. But I just want, for the audience, because you threw a lot of things out there that sound technical, like there's real stakes here, ethical stakes. And you obviously, I think personally, and maybe before I get into the Wrath of Zion one, if you want to answer maybe where you think that comes from on a personal level, maybe your principle of free expression or a free internet or something like that, you've clearly had that along the way.
Yeah, I'll say, of course, the reason counter sex trafficking is used as kind of the marketing is that it is an important issue. It is serious. It should be addressed, right? But
and it's hard to argue it, right?
Right?
It's hard to be against it, right? Right.
But who are we kidding that that's what the Pentagon does?
Yeah.
Like that. Obviously, it's a trope to anyone who's been in kind of this surveillance, space for some time that you always use pedophilia as the sort of entryway into broader surveillance. And yes, precisely because it is such a serious issue.
Yeah.
But I named the year as 2013. Obviously, that was also the year Snowden went public.
Yeah.
And so if you're at all reading the news, that's on your mind. That's been almost 12 years now. So, as Michelle Flournoy, a former Undersecretary of Defense, has said pretty publicly, the Snowden hangover is over now. But if you were, doing government contracting in that time period, it was probably fresh on your mind, especially on the academic side of things.
Yeah, it was back with a vengeance this week with Tulsi Gabbard being grilled about Snowden. I don't know if you saw that, some of that going viral, and it's quite strange. But I'll revisit that later in our conversation about.
But not on the corporate side.
Not
corporation.
On the corporate side. Yeah.
Corporations themselves, especially at the leadership level, I think have undone a lot of that posture.
Okay. Well, let's save the sort of underground or undertow questions I have about where has this general question gone in society of privacy and security. And tell me then, so let's go to this Wrath of Zion thing. So you all have said in the intro that you started this tech inquiry organization, and its role is to keep an eye on this kind of stuff and do this kind of publication. So what did you find with the Wrath of Zion program, investigation, whatever, that DropSite ended up putting out?
Yeah, the truth is it was a pretty quick investigation. I had a colleague, who's a journalist, forward me a tweet, I want to say on Thursday, that was this youth movement is how it's broadly described, organization called Beitar. Their U.S. arm had tweeted out that they were going to surveil and use facial recognition to de-anonymize all of the attendees of a vigil for a killed 5-year-old Palestinian girl named Hin Rajab.
Yeah, this was the 1-year anniversary vigil. Yeah.
Right, that was going to take place at Zuccotti Park in New York City. And so I thought, obviously this is pretty aggressive. I'd been following for months, very effectively every cabinet member of the new Trump administration has been promising to deport pro-Palestinian student protesters. And so as a civil liberties issue, I think that's been a central concern of mine. And so my interest was immediately picked for, one, who is this terror watch agency that is being named as the facial recognition provider, and what is going on in reality. And so you go to the website of Terror Watch Agency, and there's no names. Though if you go into the Wayback Machine, which is this
Hmm.
archive of websites you can check out, if you go back I want to say a couple of years, you see this picture of someone calling themselves Eliyahu Hawali.
Mm.
And so, you Google the name, and it's actually a pretty famous person, but not for positive reasons. And so, they've become a minor celebrity of sorts in the Jewish community, because they were a Lebanese-born Muslim that joined the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New York City.
Mm.
So they actually were a student in aerospace engineering, like myself, but at Texas A&M, in fact, where I was born, as opposed to UT Austin, where I went, but much younger. And they dropped out right before graduation, moved to Brooklyn, and sort of over time after immigrating from Lebanon had sort of adopted the persona of ultra Orthodox. And so when they were outed after, you know, um, even tricking their wife for and basically they became a celebrity because this was such an unheard of thing. There was actually an FBI investigation that was launched. There were
Mm.
fears that this person calling themselves Eliyahu was actually an Islamic terrorist that was infiltrating the New York Jewish community. And New York authorities ultimately determined there was no such threat. This is just someone who that's their, genuine beliefs. They just, this is what they are. And then actually in a very prominent way, they ended up flying to Israel over Passover weekend in 2022 and starting the process of converting. And then actually over time, they now swear that they are actually Jewish. And so
Mm.
it's this really rather strange story because Tablet, which is a somewhat conservative Jewish outlet, ran a pretty critical piece on him in 2021 and essentially exposed just this litany of lies. At one point, he'd, faked that he worked for the National Security Agency, faking emails, sending it to his wife, like a congratulations when they got married. And so this may sound like a bit of a tangent, but it's actually really important for understanding kind of the deception
Mm.
that's going on because there's this, so Eliyahu Hawilis started this company called Stellar Cyber and then is marketing this facial recognition tool called Nesher AI, which is what is being advertised by Beitar, this student movement, as being used to dox the pro-Palestinian protesters. And so, for context, the person that creates that facial recognition program is just a known liar in
Mm.
the sort of extreme, right? And so it's a bit challenging thing to report on because on the one hand, it's an extremely aggressive action, but on the other, to what degree is it sort of puffed up and really
Yeah.
just meant to scare
Like it's a
people away
threat. Yeah.
from attending? Right. And so actually, even since reporting that piece, I think just more and more evidence is piling up that frankly, these groups are just liars.
Yeah.
Um, so I published a new piece this morning after having driven out to DC from Philadelphia yesterday to attend a protest or a rally that was co-organized by Beitar, and they were actually thrown out. It was a pretty small group, about five or so people, and there was a group of Israelis, including parents of hostages, that pretty aggressively confronted them and kicked
Mm.
them out of the protest, which was interesting to see because, these groups can have really aggressive social media presences. And obviously, they have access to politicians, like, here in Pennsylvania with John Fetterman, Ted Cruz in Texas, actually, another Texas politician. Um, Representative Weber, who recently joined the Judea and Samaria caucus. which is trying to outlaw, or not outlaw, but to ban the text or the phrase West Bank in use by the U.S. government. And so, um, in fact, two members of that caucus, Claudia Tenney and Representative Weber, um, were named by Beitar as attending a press conference on Monday. And everything kind of disappeared about that press conference. And then I called the offices and they confirmed to me that actually they never even confirmed attendance.
Yeah.
And then similarly, I confirmed with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement on Monday that these very viral claims of a UCLA student being deported, named Liu Lijun, allegedly, actually never happened. And yet, if you go to the social media feed of Beitar, they claim that she was, quote, high on their list and many more to come, right? And so you have this weird blend of like just outright fabrications with real political access and in fact frankly ties to intelligence agencies. And so it's a bit of a weird thing to unravel because it's both serious but also you can't take it at face value,
Right.
right?
Like they
Even
weren't
within
actually bringing any, like they're not actually facially recognizing, they're not doing anything. They're just threatening, they're doing a social media game. It's all posturing and it has real consequences, but you're not like, as a tech guy that you are, you're not going in to uncover some secret, spying agency of Beitar, right?
right.
It's just and like at the protests were they just spewing a bunch of hateful stuff or whatever, and the people were like, "Get the heck out of here! We don't."
Well, they were accusing the parents of the hostages of being pro-Hamas.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah.
And that was part of why they were kicked out
Yeah.
across the street. And then they had a truck driving around in front of the White House that said there is no genocide in Gaza and we support the deportation of jihadis from the U.S. and Gaza.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, on the other hand, you can't really undersell this either because tools like Clearview AI are very cheap, right? Like really, it doesn't cost much. And in fact, there are free facial recognition tools. So to some degree, like it's just incompetence on their part that they're not doing what they promise.
Right. So let's move to some of that actually, because it sounds like these Beitar guys are, I don't know how you would characterize them, kind of trolling, intimidating, talking a big game with real consequence. I don't want to undermine that. I'm not on social media, but I imagine the funhouse mirror warped view of reality is warped significantly by their actions and big numbers and viral, and it has real effect. But let's then move to what you just said there of what can tech companies do. I mean, your stance, your actions at Google, if I had to characterize them, it was in the Snowden vein of just that, like, maybe you weren't comfortable with it, whether or not you cared if the American people should know, but this alliance, this thing that happened of the corporate world and the military world or the police world, however you're going to put it, kind of just working in concert through third parties. You can explain how this all works or whatever it is something that didn't sit right with you morally, ethically, and at least we never seem to have a legitimate conversation about it as a civilization or as a people or as a country of where these lines should be. And maybe it's just much worse than we thought. So tell me now, like, what is really possible? If Beitar wanted to do that kind of thing, what would they do? Could they have access to it? Peel back those layers then, like, how much are we in danger of a group like that actually being able to do what they claim they already are doing? Or is it already happening with other groups? I don't know. You tell me.
Well, first, maybe as a minor point of fact, actually, the reason I ended up leaving Google was over a human rights issue relating to U.S. companies complying with censorship and surveillance demands from the Chinese government.
Right.
I did speak out on issues relating to Maven afterwards, which was a Pentagon military effort, but kind of counter what people may think. I think you can take broader human rights positions that aren't quite so clearly labeled as, pro or anti kind of traditional U.S. foreign policy. but in terms of what happened, like, look, even journalists use facial recognition, right? Like, so it's not that this is some, it, and I was very critical of this. Like, even pro-privacy, human rights oriented civil society used facial recognition against the January 6th protesters.
Hmm.
Like Ronan Farrow, of all people, published a piece in the New Yorker using facial recognition to identify one of the military members of January 6th. So it's sort of anybody who knows how to use the internet
Yeah.
can get facial recognition at this point. Like, organizations like Bellingcat use, like it's sort of this weird thing of everybody knows you can do it, but it's a question of do you endorse it
Hmm.
or not? And so the fact that, you have kind of online trolls, perhaps over exaggerating their access to facial recognition. I mean, honestly, I just see it as incompetence if they're not
Right.
delivering what they're promising. Like, I mean, there's any number of ways that you can access such technology.
Hmm.
Um, and so maybe the more technical side of things is, can you de-anonymize someone when they're wearing, let's say, a keffiyeh or a mask? But actually, a huge number of companies during COVID were advertising precisely that you could identify people with tweaks to their technology if you uh, when you were wearing masks. So there's nothing, I don't want to, veer out of my lane
Yeah.
and present expertise that I don't have, but I think there is an assumption a lot of people make that you can only be identified by your full face. And in fact, if you look at the literature of like biometrics, even just your ear, people can identify you from.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you're wearing a mask is not sort of a cure-all for such a thing. And maybe as a, brief aside on this, one of the kind of arguments that's interesting that's made against a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters is that they wear masks and therefore that's sort of an unethical position and it implies you're somehow being subversive. But literally Beitar, if you just Google them, for example, in France, there are videos of all of their members training in Krav Maga wearing
Hmm.
masks to keep their identities a secret. And so, it's kind of just a common thing anytime you're in the more uh, let's say aggressive side of activism
Hmm.
that people start wearing masks. But obviously, each side may emphasize the other's adoption as something to critique them on.
Yeah. Yeah. So then tell me then about like the sort of how surveillance tech really works as far as you understand it with data brokers and mass trafficking, and then what is the alliance? How do you characterize it of the Pentagon or the DoD and private corporations like Google? Explain to me just the sort of the state of things to the average user of how this all works. Are we giving our data away willingly when we click the terms and conditions agree button, and then what happens?
Yes, I mean, I would say there's two sides of the coin that Americans need to worry about. One is the wiretap side,
Hmm.
will kind of by design ideally affect a much smaller number of people, where companies like Penlink is based in Nebraska teach and actually handhold police through not only the warrant process, but for example, grabbing your Google search history,
Hmm.
what you looked at in Google Maps. In fact, I witnessed one of the executives or the sales representatives from that company explaining how Apple iCloud backups were one of his favorite things to grab through warrants.
Hmm.
Because, for example, if you have WhatsApp and you are texting someone, you're like, oh, this is end-to-end encrypted. But actually, and maybe this is fixed now, but what Penlink was bragging about is that those text messages would be automatically backed up in your Apple iCloud backups.
Hmm.
And then they would just grab those backups with search warrants, and then they'd have copies of these exchanges that you thought were super secret. And so you can think of that sort of wiretapping side of things as, obviously it applies to what the US is doing to non-US citizens as well.
Hmm.
Uh, But then there's this other entire world of what you could call maybe the data broker side, or
Yeah.
the front door as opposed to the back door of wiretaps. And maybe you could argue one is the front door and one is the back door, and vice versa. But there's sort of the going through the back end of the tech companies, and then there's going through sort of a much less controversial approach of saying, oh, well, you consented to this in the first place.
Hmm.
So there's been this entire industry that to some degree has been shut down, um, of data brokers who, for example, through shady applications on your phone, collect your cell phone location from the GPS device, actually to pretty extreme precision, maybe like within a meter,
Wow.
say every 5 seconds, and then sell that to basically anybody who's interested. Um,
And these are these
and
apps, by the way. Sorry, I'm going to cut you out sometimes, but I just want to clear. Some of these apps are running in the background without your permission. I don't know. You tell me, is that legal or like people agreeing to that?
well, I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the
Sorry.
companies will say that you consented, and,
Yeah.
and and I should clarify that one of the complexities here that actually matters is that um, there's this sort of, you know, most precise access is if you have like, there was this app Muslim Pro,
Yeah.
which is a prayer application for Muslims that turns out to have been selling location data to a data broker called Xmode Social, that renamed to OutLogic. And um, if you're doing that level of access, it's like very high reliability, very accurate down to, let's say, the meter level.
Hmm.
But then far more applications are really just grabbing much less precise data from what's called a real-time bidding process, which just, I don't want to go into the weeds on that.
Yeah.
Frankly, I'm not an expert on it, but it's a different way to grab your location data than directly instrumenting an application to just access your GPS device.
Right.
And that was one of a very large number of applications that were serving as vehicles for location tracking data were revealed pretty recently through a hack of a company called Gravy Analytics,
Hmm.
which ran a subsidiary called Vintel. Not to get too into it, but it's actually owned now by a Swedish company called Unicast. And you can find detailed reporting on this, and for example, 404 Media of which apps. Candy Crush was
Hmm.
one of the maybe most prominent applications that was being used through this real-time bidding process to collect cell phone location tracking data through Gravy Analytics. And Gravy has actually kind of been the most influential company besides Xmode, which got kind of mostly shut itself down from this space. And they are the power, at least according to past reporting, this tool called Locate X, which was run by a separate company named Babel Street.
Hmm.
And between those two, they've been the power players, if you will, in the market of selling cell phone location tracking data to US government agencies, for example.
Yeah.
Like the Defense Intelligence Agency has been a customer, US Army Intelligence has been a customer, US Special Operations Command in Africa. I mean, many, many different US agencies have made use of it. But I did some reporting, I want to say about a year ago, on the kind of collapse of this market
Hmm.
in practice. There was a company called Orbital Insight that I had a pretty significant leak on, which, believe it or not, was acquired by a company Steve Wozniak now runs,
Hmm.
called Privateer Space. But before that happened, I started reporting on this company, and basically what they did is something you could call pattern of life analysis, but resold to corporations. So, natural question, well, what the hell is pattern of life analysis? It basically means like, where is someone and what do they do? Like, kind of what's your schedule
Yeah.
would be a rough way to say it.
Yeah.
And often from the perspective, if I have your cell phone location data, like, 9 to 5 on weekdays, you're at this office doing X, you go to the gym,
Mm-hmm.
like kind of what's the description of your activities. Um, and so that's something that's really common in intelligence agencies, but it's not like, for example, in Afghanistan, when we were, tracking members of Al Qaeda, one of the things you would do is fly drone surveillance and map out patterns of life of people.
Right.
But you can also get that in other ways. And so, obviously, one of the things that happens is war zone kind of surveillance techniques. People get the bright idea of, well, what if we sell this to companies instead? And so, actually, one of the things Orbital Insight was most known for was selling similar kind of pattern of life analysis, but to map out the supply chains of companies to root out forced labor practices and
Hmm.
child labor. So, for example, Unilever contracted Orbital Insight to use cell phone location tracking data to basically track which factories were in its supply chain. Because sometimes companies just don't know where they get their materials from. And so if you saw one person at like your factory that you know about, and then they were in this other place that involves child labor, and you see that enough times from enough people, you can start to get the sense that maybe I have a dependency in my supply chain that is that
Yeah.
um, particular factory that's using child labor. And so that was the marketing for it. But as it turns out, the company had its commercial product collapse because of a number of things that kind of combined together, which was one, Apple instituted this app tracking transparency tool, which basically made it opt in to grabbing that sort of detailed GPS data, which really kicked out one leg of the stool from this industry. And the other was one of the major suppliers of the data was a family safety application called Life 360.
Hmm.
And as parents track their children, right? And so you enable this detailed location tracking data. And it turns out that was a very major source uh, of cell phone location tracking data that was resold. Another was Gas Buddy,
Hmm.
uh, you could use to, I guess, track gasoline prices. Um, and so basically, what engineers at Orbital Insight told me was that they started buying cell phone location tracking data. And when they did kind of internal audits, they found that it was just re-timestamped data from like a year earlier that basically had just been modified to claim it was current.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so they started kind of panicking because they were trying to buy us from multiple sources and they just kept seeing that it was all like fraudulently
Hmm.
produced from the same sources. And then the US government still wanted to buy the data, but the engineers sort of took an ethical stand and said, we're not
Yeah.
gonna sell the US government this fraudulent product. And so their commercial market had collapsed, and what they instead pivoted to was contracting with the Indonesian State Intelligence Agency, which is Indonesia's rough analog of the CIA,
Hmm.
which I found through recorded investor meetings. Uh, and that was kind of interesting to me because it gives you a sense that we kind of have this conversation where we assume that US surveillance companies primarily are funded by the US government. And that's just not true. Like, obviously, that's true in many cases, but they're not going to market, you know, uh, the UAE government being their main customer or
Yeah.
the Indonesian government and that they're surveilling potentially, human rights activists and indigenous groups in West Papua. That's just not, doesn't fit into the preferred narrative of authoritarianism versus democracy,
Right.
or the so-called arsenals of democracy argument that's made by companies like Anduril now. And so you kind of have to find that stuff through leaks and whistleblowers. Maybe that's a long-winded way of
No,
answering
that's
your question, but it turns out that the contract Orbital Insight was serving as the sort of data fusion software platform for.
yeah.
they were combining wiretapping from companies like Trovacor to get basically, according to one source that with direct knowledge, the equivalent of what Life 360 was providing, but just for the whole country,
Yeah.
with satellite surveillance and combining the two together, and then
Yeah.
providing the intelligence services.
No, it was, I mean, it was a detailed, it was a really good map through that world. And there's a few things I just wanted to highlight under, just make sure I understand it too, because it was, again, you brought up child trafficking, right? Like these were, or child labor or something, forced child labor. Again, there's this balance, there's this ethical argument. They could say that there's these potential good uses, all of this data could be used to save lives or protect people, but obviously the dark side of this that's just under everything you said is the potential. And I don't know, you could tell me how real. I mean, it's interesting, Indonesia versus the UAE versus America, whatever. Like whatever agency or government or institution has all this, it is potentially Minority Report level, scary stuff, George Orwell, eat your heart out kind of stuff. I mean, but I still kind of want to make sure I understand the pipeline of how the U.S. government, for example, just the U.S. government, acquires this stuff. Like the buyer at the end, is it fair to say that there's this layer at the bottom, which is mostly apps on app stores or website cookies that you agree to or whatever? Like, I don't know what percentage you put at, like mostly uh, in quotes, volunteered information. Not that anybody ever reads the terms and conditions. There was a fantastic documentary about 10 years ago now called Terms and Conditions May Apply that was about this conversation. I'll link to it. But at this bottom layer, it's us. It's people in the populace walking around with a phone in our pocket or going to websites, generating data, and it's being logged somewhere. And so if that first layer is mostly, again, volunteer apps, maybe there's a percentage of like Clearview
It
that's
was
stealing it. Yeah, tell me that
so
first
it's
layer.
two paths is what I was trying
Okay.
to emphasize. There's this sort of data brokerage market, but then obviously what you'd rather do is just directly wiretap everything
Right.
if you can get away with it.
Do you have
Now,
a sense
obviously,
of the percentage of what's
I mean,
what? Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to have that level of
Yeah.
insight. I would say, obviously, the American government would get in a lot of trouble if it was just wiretapping, let's say, Verizon for everybody's
Right.
location all the time. But the American government really has no hesitation about doing that in other countries, right?
Right. Fair enough. Okay.
And so it's really a matter of domestic protection that you
Yeah.
don't do wiretaps on telecoms.
And so let's just go through the other data or the other pipeline first again, which I know you walked through, but just to explain it. And there's another company I've heard you talk about, or an app again. Like again, I'm going to go sort of through the volunteered public app or whatever, or path. Is what was it called? Smile, or the Smile, where like it would show an emoji face to kids
Oh,
or
Smile
something.
ML. Yeah,
Smile ML. Yeah.
yeah, I wrote briefly about them. I want to say a few years ago, maybe 2021. Um,
What
I
was
don't
it
think I
even
wrote about
marketed
them.
as? Was it marketed as like autism training or something? Like,
There was an app that was actually in the Apple App Store approved for very young users, which was
yeah.
kind of the most shocking thing for me because the company was also contracting with US Special Operations Command on emotion recognition. And for people who don't know what US Special Operations Command is, it was created in the wake of something most people are familiar with, which was the failed hostage rescue in Tehran at the end of the Carter administration,
Hmm.
where a bunch of helicopters failed during the raid. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. In fact, originally it was known as Operation Rice Bowl, as a deception operation to imply it was Asia. But um, basically, this is like during the War on Terror, this is the group of people who you could think of as the nighttime door kickers. But the traditional role before that sort of direct action side of things really kicked up in, let's say, the 70s. Um, Special operations in the US was like guerrilla warfare. So think like Vietnam training indigenous groups and supporting the nationalist Chinese against the communist Chinese, things like this. So that's what, there are numerous missions. And so, um, anyway, this company that, is sitting in the App Store for even children to use was also selling its emotion recognition to U.S. Special Operations Command. Um, I never really dug into that after that report. I mean, it's sitting on
Yeah.
official U.S. government databases. There's nothing like really controversial about the conclusion, even if it is kind of shocking.
And they were purchasing directly from them, or was it a data broker
No,
layering
it's
on
just
top?
directly from that
Direct.
company. Yeah. And so actually maybe the most shocking thing about that report that I learned later is that it was passed around at the highest levels of US military incorporation of AI, particularly for the drone warfare effort, because they didn't think people could figure that stuff out from just looking at what the US government was disclosing through its procurement
Mm-hmm.
databases. And in fact, I confirmed this a few months ago, like hundreds of millions of dollars of the contracts that I noted in that report were silently deleted from official US government record
Hmm.
after I published the report, which is kind of still incredible to me that that
Yeah.
can happen. And in fact, the DoD even explained to me the particular regulation that justified their ability to go in and delete things that I cited. There was something called the Federal Acquisition Regulation. There are particular provisions that said on national security grounds you can go in and withhold things.
Yeah.
Um,
And this, I just want to, this particular app, I don't know how popular it was or whatever, it would like show an emoji or a face, and the kid would have to, or whoever was using it would like smile if it saw a smile, or frown if it saw a frown, or
yeah.
look quizzical or whatever. And of course, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure this is training data
Mhm.
for, I don't know, if you plug that into an AI that's figured out how to do that to some degree and it's reading everyone's face in a crowd, does it know if everyone's smiling or frowning? The implications of that are whatever. Again, let your
Yeah.
imagination run wild, but that's what
To
that's
be
what how the
clear,
app worked.
well, to be
Yeah.
clear, I don't know which particular inputs were in the models that they trained and sold to the DoD. But it's not like that's unusual, right? Like, so
Right.
there's Ever Album was a famous company that had online photos. They basically decided, oh wait, we're a facial recognition company now. And so they renamed to Paravision and they became a significant reseller of facial recognition to the DoD. In fact,
Yeah.
Clearview AI recently started ramping up its sales of facial recognition to the Department of Defense a bit. It's not a lot of money. It's like I think they've had a total of about $300,000 in sales to the Department of Defense, which relatively speaking is a drop in the bucket, at least through what's publicly disclosed. Um, but in Clearview AI, for example, just they to give them sort of their perspective, they claim to just be Google for faces. And so just
Yeah.
like Google scrapes the public internet, they say they just scrape the public internet. But it's a good test case for to what degree information that's technically public is fair game for usage in artificial intelligence. And most
Yeah.
major tech companies in the US have decided this is a bit too far. And so,
Yeah.
like if you try to do an image search in Google, they'll purposefully limit it if it's a face. Um,
Yeah. I want to ask you is I know you're trying to speak as an objective journalist, but I do want to ask you some personal-ish questions just as to response of like when Mark Zuckerberg made it rounds a little bit or whatever, when he posted a picture of his family on Facebook, I think it was like for the holidays, and then he put like an emoji to blur out his two kids' faces, and it made this big kind of fuss. I mean, how do you, as someone who spent some time in the Google environment, and like, how do you just react to that emotionally, and then maybe I don't know if they're sort of journalistic, hey, there's something to dig into here, like how do you react to that stuff?
I mean, honestly, I think that's fair. I mean, I think people should
Yeah.
generally provide privacy for children. In fact, that was kind of my first serious concern at Google was a project where there was a rather blasé attitude taken towards the usage of children's data. And in fact, you can Google this. The FTC enforced what's called a COPPA violation fine on Google, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. I think there's two P's, COPPA. Maybe there's only one. And I should also say, to give the FTC its credit, they've played a pretty major role, actually, even post all of the stuff I mentioned with Orbital Insight in cracking down on companies, including Gravy Analytics. Though an interesting kind of fact is that I found their investigation into Gravy Analytics before it was public by digging into procurement databases. And when I reached out for comment, the FTC deleted the information as well from
Yeah.
public databases. And then when I did a Freedom of Information request, they basically gave me the middle finger and said, you're not allowed to get any of this information.
Hmm.
And so, an interesting question about to what degree we kind of just see the FTC as kind of a good guy that's above being subject to traditional transparency requirements. I tend to think every agency should be transparent when it's in government, but that's not necessarily a popular perspective in the privacy community.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of my perspective on this, look, I went to a trade show where Clearview AI was present. Or no, it was actually a sheriff's association meeting. And I spoke to Clearview AI, and they really did not like being recorded, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a bit funny because that's what they sell is facial recognition on people, and it's non-consensual. So I think it's kind of, you can play the hypocrisy card, but who isn't to some degree a hypocrite? Like,
Hmm.
it's not, I mean, of course, people are going to try and, um, be defensive when they can and be aggressive when it suits them. But yeah, I mean, it is hypocrisy for sure, but I don't think it's really necessarily surprising or noteworthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I asked that because I'm like, we stumbled into this world of, you and I are both old enough to remember childhoods without this level of, a tracking device in all of our pockets. And we like the conversation about the trade-off of privacy and security. What's the famous Ben Franklin quote? Like, those who will trade liberty for security deserve neither. Like, there is a tension there that I've mentioned a few times now. Like, I remember the first time with the iPhone and tracking or whatever, when it just became a very like obvious social norm that everyone was carrying this thing in their phone, in their pocket, and basically was a tracking device. And the nightmare scenario of your daughter is kidnapped and she's somewhere in the city, and you go to the police and you tell them, and you're like, we need to find them, and hey, you could I have the password to her phone and you could see where she is and track her, and they say, oh no, there's privacy concerns. And for a second there, that conversation was like, okay, that's the nightmare scenario where the rubber really meets the road about how do we clearly there's a potential for this stuff to be abused in the hands of a fascist government, or let's say a government which wants to deport pro-Palestinian students. As you've said, we all have our eye on that now. And then there's also this other side of like, hey, we could get the bad guys and save your daughter if we could just unlock her phone, even if it's a violation of her privacy or your privacy or whatever. Like, what? I guess that's why I'm asking that, of like, how worried are you about that balancing act, that it just seems that dilemma, that question really isn't asked anymore? We sort of just handed all of this over. I mean, as someone, again, who's like sort of seen the inside of it, how worried are you about this situation? Clearly your job as a journalist, and you write really well, and again, you're really fair. I think you've said it well. It seems like your mission is to like be like, you just want people to know, like transparency, right?
Well,
Like,
I'll admit at the beginning
yeah.
of Tech Inquiry, it was an advocacy organization.
Oh, okay,
And it
interesting.
actually took a while before I changed. And
Hmm.
I'll be honest, the reason was I had a contract with a union for about a year, and you think, a union's going to be pretty lefty and critical of corporations and power.
Hmm.
I would say like criticism of power is, if anything, kind of I see as a central point of journalism. um, at the end of the report, they actually demanded that I silently remove all criticism of both Microsoft and Israel. And not even just
Hmm.
criticism, they wanted no discussion of Microsoft or Israel. And the Microsoft side was because they were the international labor training arm of CWA, which is the Communications Workers of America. And during the year-long contract, they signed a backroom deal with Microsoft known as the Labor Neutrality Agreement. So therefore, they said, okay, well, we can't have anything that looks critical of Microsoft now. So retroactively, you need to delete anything discussing them from your report. And then second, because they are funded by a particular foundation of the German government, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is like, for anybody who knows what National Endowment for Democracy is in the US, there's the
Hmm.
Democratic arm, the National Democratic Institute, and the Republican arm, the International Republican Institute. The German Social Democratic Party has its own equivalent known as Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And they said you cannot discuss any US cloud company having a contract with the Israeli military, both from their DC office and their Tel Aviv office. And so in the end, I
Hmm.
realized, like, wait a second, this is like the labor group even trying to tell me for their, because they have activism goals that I can't criticize $1 trillion company or like cloud contracts with the Israeli military. So at that point, I kind of just realized, you know what, I just have to go full journalist, for lack of a
Hmm.
way to say it. You can't, if your goal is just holding the powerful to account, there really is no ally that, will do activism and support you in that. And that may sound like a
Hmm.
strong statement, and it's not always going to be true, but in some cases it will. Um, the way I would frame it is that journalism is like maybe truth tempered by justice, and activism is justice tempered by truth.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they're
No, I like
different,
that. Yeah.
different North Stars, right?
Yeah.
Come to shove, you're going to choose a different priority. And so maybe that's a long-winded way of kind of the honest history of the organization. But yeah, I try to, I think it's worthwhile just to keep your head on straight. Like you can have whatever analysis you want in the end, like editorial on top, but I think that like the cake itself, you should be objective, and maybe the icing is the opinion.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I like that. And so when that shift, well, tell me before that shift happened, you were an active. You would describe it as advocacy for what? To cease so much. You were more of like a pro-privacy group. Like that's what you were trying to do,
I
and
would
then.
I would say the first solid year is something I would even now describe as pretty naive activism
Hmm.
criticizing US corporate relationships with China. Um,
Got right, of course. Yeah.
and I mean, because that's one of the things I'd spoken out. And I don't regret speaking out on those issues. I just wouldn't have partnered with the same people
Hmm.
now. And some of the things I don't think I understand. Like, look, my last day at Google was a meeting with the head of the company's AI and research department, a guy named Jeff Dean. And
Hmm.
I was being probably pretty aggressive in my questions through this kind of Zoom video or whatever the Google Meet meeting we had. And, I asked the question of, well, what would we do if someone in China used our modification of Google and they searched the term human rights? Would we hand them over to the Chinese security services? And the response was, for all you know, we're already handing that person over to US intelligence agencies.
Hmm.
I mean, not in those exact words, but that basically FISA warrants, for all I knew, were already playing the same role. And it's an
Yeah.
interesting kind of question. And actually, the way I interpreted it at the time was, oh, well, there's kind of just a race to the bottom in terms of protections. And because the US government from the Snowden era kind of is seen as having forfeited any sort of moral standing, that therefore US companies would be hypocritical not to kind of comply with intelligence service demands on
Hmm.
human rights activists. I think that's kind of a really bad place to be and to end up, that I wasn't comfortable with. But maybe in hindsight, it is an interesting question of why wouldn't the US, through FISA warrants, demand, like suppose you're the CIA and you want to develop an asset in China. Of course, you're going to go after the human rights activists.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of an interesting question of like, well, what is happening through intelligence services on social media searches, like both domestically and abroad. Um, but so um, yeah, so I did a lot. I went and spoke at the UN at one point
Hmm.
on some of these issues. There were some members of the group that did active that had resigned from actually even Google over Project Maven, from another startup named Clarify over Project Maven. Um, and so over time, I was trying to be broad-based. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never run a nonprofit. And I went and met a bunch of people from uh, the Pentagon it's actually at Stanford for a meeting where I was asked to kind of be I don't know, a stand-in for someone critical of why tech workers shouldn't have to build weapons for the Pentagon. And I wanted to speak about kind of freedom of expression issues, and all the Pentagon cared about was why aren't you building weapons?
Hmm.
Um, and so it gave me a sense that that's all that like the human rights discourse is kind of just marketing, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no real power there. That's State Department stuff. Like the actual brunt of the um relationship between tech companies and the US government is really just about like the intelligence and defense side of things. And so to some degree it's kind of you're missing the broader picture if you just want to have a freedom of expression discussion when it comes to international relations. And so I think understanding the military relationship I found to just be a central piece of this, even when I tried to speak to the government about human rights issues.
Right.
And obviously now that's even, like at that time it was sort of, and in fact, until very recently, it was what, like yesterday that Google finally dropped its "we won't build," weapons in out of its AI principles.
Yeah.
So I mean, still happening to this day that companies kind of want to pretend that they won't, or US tech companies that were primarily consumer focused tried to have this facade of being kind of you know clouds and cartoons, when
Yeah.
the reality they're also you know a pretty significant interface for wiretapping and intelligence and defense.
Yeah.
Like example, Google was one of five participants in a quote tens of billions of dollars cloud contract with the CIA known as Commercial Cloud Enterprise, or C2E, um, along with Amazon and Microsoft and Oracle and IBM. Like, name a big US tech company, and they're working pretty closely with every US intelligence agency for the cloud.
Yeah.
Um,
And there, I mean, how would you categorize or characterize, like, what are they doing? What is their goal? Is it to have a, you know, computer somewhere that somebody could just go find me and get a full profile and a pretty accurate schedule of where I've been every week and a prediction of where I'll be next week at a certain time and my beliefs and my thoughts? And I mean, it sounds like sci-fi stuff, but then of course, like, is that has to be obviously the goal here. And again, in the right hands, I suppose the intention could be good, but obviously the dangers are just something that there's such an ick factor to the whole thing that your reporting is impressively objective, but then also it's hard not to just sort of scare the shit out of me, be like, how close are they to that kind of
well,
view,
things
or am
don't
I
work
way
as
off?
well as
Yeah.
you. I
Yeah.
would say people often miss just how dysfunctional government agencies are.
Yeah.
Like, even to pull things back to Snowden, that was the big critique of Seymour Hersh, like a legendary investigative journalist, is that a lot of the reporting just kind of missed how bureaucratic and barely functional the NSA is.
Right.
And like, not to say that there aren't these incredible, exquisite is the term of art in this space, surveillance technologies that are, being built. Um, but you also have to keep in mind that these aren't like the tightest ships in the
Right.
world.
Right. Right. Right.
I
So
think
they
blend a
can't
little
do
bit
what
of
I
your
just.
sense of the DMV, right?
Yeah.
Like like yes, there is all this incredible stuff, but there's some DMV vibes.
Yeah.
And so especially if you start digging into the personnel that lead some of these agencies, some of
Yeah.
the people change your opinions as to how scared you are.
Yeah.
Um,
That's comforting
or at
to a
least
degree.
you should be scared in a different way.
Right. Tell me how I should be scared and then how I shouldn't be scared. Maybe that's the best
Yeah,
way to phrase it. Because
because they're
what I
not
just
as
imagined
effective
to
as you
you
think.
is probably not, it's not Dr. Claw and Mr.
Yeah.
Gadget quite yet, but
But I would say to your point of there's kind of two answers I wanted to give. One is that actually there's a good book um, called Eyes in the Sky
hmm.
on the history of a high resolution drone surveillance program called Gorgon Stare.
Hmm.
You can look up. I think Arthur Holland Michel, I believe that's the author's name. I'm embarrassed if I got it wrong, but one of the really interesting things in that book is that the inspiration for it actually came from the movie Enemy of the State.
Hmm.
So literally an employee, I think it was Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, went and saw that movie and immediately decided we have to build that. And that became his uh, you know, sole focus. And for anybody that didn't see the movie, it was, Will Smith, sees some super secret exchange, and all of a sudden, US intelligence agencies are using satellite imagery and tracking him all around the city. I mean, like, actually, a very similar thing happened with facial recognition during the Reagan administration. There was this James Bond movie where Christopher Walken was the bad guy. I want to say it was it A Time to Kill, or I forget the name, but basically Walken used facial recognition to identify James Bond.
Hmm.
The then director of the CIA, William Casey, went, "We have to build that." And so it's in fact there's a degree to which, life imitates art in
Yeah.
some of these, but the actual historical example or broader, let's say tectonic understanding to have is something called the third offset strategy, which is the, let's say, post 2000 understanding that the US government has had that most technological innovation is within corporations, not within the government. And so um, the third offset strategy is broadly that the US realizes the only way to, say, compete against China and Russia is to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning into the US military to operate at a faster pace. So, like, they don't want to just hit one target every day, they want to hit 1,000 targets in one day. Particularly, hypothetically, suppose China is going to invade Taiwan tomorrow. They want to be able to hit like 1,000 boats
Yeah.
trying to invade the island in one day. And so, a natural question any listener might have is, well, okay, that's the third offset strategy. What's the second and what's the first? Turns out the first was right after World War II. It was the usage of tactical nuclear weapons. So there's something you can look up called the Davy Crockett
Hmm.
rifle, as well as actually all the way into the 80s was something called the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, which was a kind of pony keg sized mini nuclear weapon. And mini is actually the right scale because it was about 1,000th of a Hiroshima,
Hmm.
that Green Berets were trained to jump out of planes with. And there were even kind of missions that they ran where they were tricked into thinking they were going to blow up a dam in Cuba. And it turns out they were actually landing in New Mexico. And it was like a test to see, like, in reality, if you told a Green Beret to do this, would they really try to do it? Or would they kind of, refuse on, let's say, pacifist grounds?
Hmm.
Um, and then the second offset was like GPS and precision guided munitions. Like, can we hit it? Can we guide a bomb anywhere we want? Um, and actually, that ties in a bit because the cell phone location tracking we talked about, of course, is based upon GPS,
Yeah.
which is an invention from the second offset strategy. Um, and a lot of that was developed kind of directly by what you might call industrial policy of the US government kind of dictating what it wants. Whereas the world we're in right now, it's more like the US government sees private companies doing all these things and it's trying to kind of catch a ride
Yeah.
and maybe tweak it a little bit. And so one of the kind of central organizations in this is the Defense Innovation Unit out of the Pentagon, which has admitted it should be called the Commercial Innovation Unit, or Defense Commercialization Unit, I think is what they've said they should be called. And basically, they, find companies like Anduril or, that are building things that they see they could tweak a little bit, and they kind of do the extra 5 or 10% on top to guide it towards what the Pentagon needs. And that's become more of the model. So with like the Googles of the world, obviously, if you're going to run the Pentagon in a modern age with a lot of data, I mean, keep in mind the Pentagon's the largest organization in the world. It's got a lot of data. It's a big enterprise in that sense. And so it needs a big cloud if it's not going to build it itself. And if you kind of understand that it's a bit incompetent and that they have a lot of trouble even keeping their emails working, frankly, which is a famous critique from Air Force. It's not a shock that they kind of want that there's a bit of jealousy. The NSA, for example, famously is like jealous of a lot of the technology at Google. And so these, government institutions basically want to just adopt and integrate as much as they can with US governments for even basic, with US tech companies for even basic infrastructure. But obviously, ChatGPT is a big draw. Basically, any AI innovation. So for Project Maven, it was how can we incorporate Google's, computer vision technology to sort through, like if you have, I mentioned earlier this book, Eyes in the Sky. And basically what we do in Afghanistan is that we'd park, at one point anyway, this is how it worked. We'd park a drone, in particular an MQ-9 Reaper drone, which is the successor to the MQ-1 Predator. And we'd attach a device called a Gorgon Stare to it, which at one point was basically 300 cell phone cameras just sitting, parked underneath the drone, and it would film a whole city. And then the question is, okay, well, how many people in the Air Force would need to stare at that footage to actually find what you want to look at? And so the idea was, well, okay, we've got companies like Google, they can search through like the internet. Now they're doing computer vision. They should just be able to search through all of that drone footage and tell us what's interesting, and we'll just kind of automate it. And so that became kind of that was the so-called Pathfinder project for the Pentagon. It was, again, called Project Maven, and then it was run by the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which was kind of colloquially known as the Maven Factory. Then, to keep up with this stuff, there's all kinds of mergers and name changes.
It seems you keep your eye on. You're encyclopedic. I don't know how much of your head is filled with all of the who owns what and who traded what. It's kind of wild.
But just to bookend it, the organization to track now, well, there's two. One is the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, or the CDAO, as it's known, is the current home of what used to be the home of Project Maven. But then part of the project got exported out to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And, it's maybe sounds like alphabet soup. There are like 18 intelligence agencies you really need to know about. NGA is basically the one that does targeting and kind of, geospatial intelligence is the term of art, like maps of the world and stuff like that.
So when you like this, I want to get your pulse on the world at the moment, and Mr. Elon Musk and a whole bunch of tech bros and tech companies and billionaires sitting in that inauguration. And this was not unique. They're in bed with both political parties or whatever, but we're in the situation now that seems rather precarious at the moment with all of these. You've talked about just a spider web of mergers, and they're in bed with each other. And I think we're both trying to be sort of, amoral, just describing it, talking about it. I'm the one putting the worries out there, that there is a conversation to be had. But, I don't follow this stuff like you do, but Donald Trump in the last couple of days dropped his first bomb, as far as I understand it, on some people in Somalia, and said they were ISIS or whatever. Like how much of that, in your estimation, just from keeping your eye on all this stuff and your little bit of knowledge in your journalistic work, do you assume is just in partnership with data collected by something like Google or whatever apps on the ground. Like how does this affect how much you read just a news event like that? I haven't even asked about what happened and is still happening in Gaza and the 972 reporting on Lavender and all your opinion on that. I don't know if you've looked into all sort of like that level of sophistication of AI targeting and where's daddy and all that. But just like how much do you assume that these relationships are, how would you say it, informing, assisting, being crucial to a degree to pull off these kinds of deadly operations, no matter what we think about them, whether people should be bombed from the sky or not.
I mean, it's not controversial that US tech companies are seen as effectively peers of the US government when it comes to military activity now. I mean, that's a pretty overt position. And,
Yeah.
people point to, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, that Microsoft helped the Ukrainian government move its cloud
Yeah.
to Microsoft so that it would, be protected. And, Starlink, Musk from SpaceX was used, as part of communication systems. And it's pretty just understood that and actually this has been a shift that is very much related to the third offset strategy that I mentioned, which is that if the innovation is now primarily in the US tech companies, then obviously the US tech companies have more political power.
Yeah. Yeah.
They control effectively the ability of the US government to wage war.
Yeah. Wow.
And so if you don't have, if effectively the whole military is running on cloud, then you need the cloud companies to play ball with you, or else you're not operating
Yeah.
anymore. And in the case of Israel, obviously it's a lot more opaque than the United States government. Not that the US is particularly transparent, like, this quote tens of billions of dollar CIA cloud contract I mentioned, C2E. It's not like that's in public procurement, but people leaked it, and then actually people from the CIA talk about it in podcasts. But at the same time, you don't know how much money is actually being spent. That's kind of in the world of conjecture right now. But I did dig into a pretty central question, which was, to what degree is Palantir the targeting system in Gaza? Because Palantir was very widely reported, including by David Ignatius in the Washington Post, even though technically it was an op-ed, to be behind what is it, the DIA targeting app used by Ukraine.
And Palantir, sorry, so Palantir's that's the Peter Thiel. Is that Peter
Yeah,
Thiel's
it's Peter Thiel's data fusion company
data
started after
fusion is
11.
like taking a bunch of different data sets, trying to combine them all, stitch them together to create a good profile on, if I have a fitness app and I have Google and I have a million other apps, there's a company that tries to stitch that all together, right?
Yeah.
That's
And then
to
likewise to
and then
control
sell it
access.
on. Okay.
Yeah, so a big thing that, to Palantir's credit, they were pretty, maybe ahead of a lot of other companies on was, think of like how the US military shares different types of data with different governments. Like, let's say, with the UK government, maybe we share everything or mostly everything. With NATO members, we share a little bit less. Now, what do we share with Saudi? Hypothetically, suppose there's some, there have been cases where we cooperate with Russia and China on particular counterterrorism things, right? Like, there's all kinds of different levels of how much data you share with whom. And you can imagine that if the US government doesn't have a lot of programmers in-house, that it could do things pretty wrongly, incorrectly in some cases. And so that was kind of the other side of things, is like access control. But yeah, like in many ways, Palantir is like is a successor to companies like Oracle, which just sell databases. And in fact, at one point, Oracle considered purchasing Palantir. But think of Palantir as like an operating system for managing all of your data. And they very much prefer that language because a lot of maybe naive reporting assumed that they were a data broker. And maybe that, I'm not saying they don't facilitate access or perhaps play that role sometimes, but that's not their product.
Gotcha.
Their product is software to sit on top of data.
Gotcha.
So Palantir's played a very major role. Actually, they run the primary implementation of Project Maven called the Maven Smart System. Um, and and then also, like I said, they were kind of credited with success in Ukraine, obviously a bit too early, but that was the narrative in maybe the early, within the first year. And so a natural hypothesis was, once the war in Gaza started, well, is Palantir the company supplying the targeting system there too? And actually, I think they're not.
Hmm.
At least the most accurate reporting I found says they're not. So, um, Globes is a business journalism outlet in Israel. And in January of last year, they seem to have had some pretty good sources saying within the Israeli Military Intelligence Directorate, um, which is, for example, the parent of Unit 8200, which most people have heard of, which is roughly Israel's NSA, arguing that Palantir was rejected by both Unit 8200 and I believe the Shin Bet,
Hmm.
and that basically they were determined not to be trustworthy enough. And that doesn't mean that the Israeli military as a whole doesn't work with Palantir. It just means, think of like at the top secret level, the most sensitive projects, the reporting from Globes was saying they were kicked out, but that they were still allowed to come in through like logistics level stuff. And so, in fact, I did some reporting in April of last year, and you can find all of this open source, in fact, that the interesting unit where US tech companies were closely partnered was the LODEM technology division of the Computer Services Directorate of the Israeli military. And you can map out, the structure. LODEM has a number of components. One of them is MAMRAM, which was the original computing unit of the Israeli military dating all the way back to the 50s. It's kind of staffed by an engineer from Rafael Advanced Systems, which is one of their major weapons producers. And um, so the primary cloud computing contracts um, go through LODEM.
Hmm.
Uh, and so at least you can find publicly that that is a major relationship. And so maybe the rough analog would be that in the United States, we have an agency called the DISA, DISA. I believe it's the Defense Information Systems Agency. And that's who runs, for example, the giant cloud contract between the Pentagon and US cloud providers,
Hmm.
known as the Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability Contract, or JWCC, which is a $9 billion ceiling contract that I want to say it was what, 2020, the end of 2023. I'm a little, time flies on some of this stuff. At
Yeah.
one point, it felt very new to me, but it's the successor contract to Jedi, which got far more press coverage,
Hmm.
partly because its name was catchier, which was the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure contract. So it maybe is an important note if you want to understand the power politics here. Jedi was being competed during the first Trump administration, and the two primary competitors were Microsoft and Amazon. And in the end, Microsoft won. And then basically, Amazon did what's called a bid protest to contest Microsoft's win because they argued that Trump was just biased against Jeff Bezos, the CEO of, or then CEO of Amazon. And uh, so basically, what the Pentagon learned is that you can't just give these giant contracts to one company. You have to give all of the companies a piece and let them continually fight for pieces. So they couldn't pick winners anymore. And so JWCC, the successor, after Jedi got canceled because of this bid protest issue, went to four companies instead of just one. And that's Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Oracle.
Hmm.
Uh, and then the CIA contract is similar, but it added in IBM. And so basically just all the US tech companies, at least through the Pentagon, go through this agency called DISA. And then when they, primarily contract with the Israeli military, it's through the rough analog, which is the Computer Services Directorate. And in fact, when Oracle lost this big cloud contract with the Israeli government known as Nimbus, which got a lot of coverage that Amazon and Google kind of jointly won. They hired a former head of the Computer Services Directorate to lobby on their behalf. So you can kind of get a sense of like, of course, that's a power player if that's who you're hiring to lobby for you. I mean, a lot of the pieces just start to make sense
Yeah.
if you kind of do basic, and then you start to see that pretty openly, in fact, these companies host events with
Yeah.
these particular units of the Israeli military, like the MAMRAM Alumni Association, like former members of that military unit, host, speakers from major U.S. cloud companies. The um, Microsoft R&D Center in Israel, actually, you could find pictures even on LinkedIn of literally their whole office full of in uniform IDF soldiers
Yeah.
being trained on how to use tools like ChatGPT. Uh, and that was, in fact, even before October 7th.
Hmm.
So you can only imagine things have ramped up since then. And in fact, there was some reporting from The Intercept on
Yeah.
some internal documents on how that ramped up.
Boy, I mean, Jack, what you're describing is like, I mean, it's hard not for me as somebody who is hoping to see some significant change and pushback to the global world order, and it might happen anyway. You're describing something that's like so much worse than a nuclear bomb or certain power plays. Like when you said I don't forget how you phrased it. It was so good. Like without the cooperation of these private companies, the U.S. could not wage war. Is that like there's something so powerful about it? If everybody was like you at all of these companies, what would happen? I mean, just play that out. I know it's an impossibility, but let's say all the CEOs suddenly are like, we're not giving this over. We're not sharing a single one or zero of data that's going to any military on Earth that is going to kill someone. If it was just a pure like pacifist takeover or whatever, would that protest literally? I don't know. What would it do to the world? Play out that game for me. It's
I mean,
just
obviously, it
yeah,
would shut down the U.S. government's ability to modernize its military.
yeah,
I mean, but that's not new that labor has that capability. I mean,
right,
dock worker regularly stop shipments of weapons to controversial destinations. But look, I'd say what I said was actually not even controversial
I
if
know.
you read the people who run the program. So, for example, there's a book that came out last year called Unit X that is written by the people who ran, in particular, the Silicon Valley branch of the Defense Innovation Unit, which I discussed earlier. Raj Shah, former fighter pilot, and then Christopher Kirchhoff was a kind of a bureaucrat that works very closely with Eric Schmidt,
Hmm.
including through Schmidt Futures. And the book is actually pretty clear that America has its own version of what we call in China civil military fusion.
Hmm.
We just say that basically we make people rich,
Hmm.
entice them rather than compelling through law. But even that is a bit disingenuous. Like, you know, even beyond the fact that like it's treated as a positive thing that America does have its own quote civil military fusion, I think it ignores the fact that we have wiretaps that are not optional,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a degree to which I think you are compelled. And obviously when Google, back when I was still there, during the first Trump administration, there was huge political pressure, not just from the US government, like the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also from executives like Michael Bloomberg and Peter Thiel saying that you are traitors
Yeah.
if you don't work for the US military. And I think there became an understanding in these companies that it's a very effective form of lobbying to get a sort of, I don't know, patriotism points.
Yeah.
If you do military partnerships, and I think now, especially entering the second Trump term, companies are kind of, you know, pretty full-throated about that. But obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a really big turning point of kind of dampening humanitarian concerns about supporting lethal activities.
Hmm.
But then the war in Gaza, or rather the genocide in Gaza,
Hmm.
um, I think rolled back a lot of that for many people. And so there've been a lot of different kind of shifts in the past few years, I think, in terms of political consciousness of what the activities are. But I think there was an event I covered in a lot of detail, I want to say also around April of last year, which is the AI Expo in DC, the very first one, hosted by former Google CEO Eric Schmidt through his Special Competitive Studies project. And the chief technology officer of the CIA, a guy named Nan Mulkandani, who incidentally was the CTO of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center when Maven was being run, uh, said that US tech CEOs now understand, and I'm paraphrasing here,
Hmm.
um, that US national security is the same thing as US technological dominance.
Yeah.
And that they're kind of all in on this mission, and that the kind of Snowden resistance is gone.
Hmm.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, like, so I was in DC, I want to say it was last week, attending a meeting hosted by kind of the foundation arm of the NGA, this organization I mentioned earlier that does GeoInt. And there was a representative from Anthropic there. And Anthropic is sort of the offshoot of OpenAI. It's meant to be kind of the ethical branch. And, you know, if you look into the background of the attendee, their former Palantir, you know, that now runs kind of the government partnerships of Anthropic. And if actually, in fact, Anthropic announced that it was reselling its large language models to the US government through Palantir, I want to say a month or two ago. Maybe, is it November? Um, and OpenAI rolled back its kind of provisions a few months, you know, the intercepts, Sam Biddle caught that. I did some reporting showing that actually, largely speaking, OpenAI had just been looking the other way as Microsoft was used as the reseller to the military.
Yeah.
And then it was reported in the intercept that there was a sort of backdoor contract to resell OpenAI to US Africa Command through this giant cloud contract I mentioned, JWCC. Um, and so really, I mean, it's almost challenging to find a major US tech company which isn't contracting in some way
Yeah.
the Pentagon, even if you can't put your finger on the amount.
Jeez. I know I've kept you a while, but I want to ask you about, because again, I won't be too worried, but I'm want to ask you about the future of revolution. And I know that's like a crazy kind of maybe thing to throw on your plate, but it's so hard to imagine what you described kind of being threatened or being, what can push back against that? I mean, what kind of successful, can people get together who have ideas to, push back against the government? I mean, these are all going to be loaded terms, right? Every man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter kind of stuff. It's like, how can a revolution of sorts break through this, as it were, or fight against it? Is there a way to sort of escape the web and the partnership that you described? Will it take a revolution of corporate revolt like yours on grand scale? I mean, it seems futile. You've heard all the people being like, well, you can't get away from it, so what are you going to do? Just shrug and live with it. I have nothing to hide. I know I'm being tracked. Well, that's all well and good at most times in history, but obviously there's plenty of reasons to want that not to be so true, not on a personal level, but on an actual ethical level of, fighting back and overthrowing totalitarian governments. And this doesn't need to just be Israel, Palestine, or even America. I have a lot of experience in East Africa, in a country like Uganda, which many people I know would love nothing more than to get a change of government of Museveni, who's been there since Idi Amin and all this kind of stuff. And it's no secret that Africa and Museveni is deep in bed with maybe Chinese data. I have no idea. You probably know more than I do. But, there, even in a place like a slum in Uganda, they're being watched and tracked in a way that just seems like a game changer in history. Or am I overstating it again? You've given me the nice caution of there's incompetence at play, but am I overstating this is such like a strange Orwellian surveillance web that I'm not sure what the future of pushback, revolt, revolution on that scale looks like. Does that question make sense? Am I still just being a crazy person here?
No, I mean, looking back historically, actually before the Project Maven protests, which I think, maybe to put it bluntly, kind of caused the Pentagon to shit its pants. I mean, you really can't overstate that, like, to this day, every meeting on AI, there's some reference to that protest. Like,
How many was it, by the way? How many people participated in the protest? It was like...
I mean, I don't even think I could put a number on it. And the reality is, in a lot of these cases, it's and anybody that understands how labor organizing works, like one of the standard descriptions is like a bullseye model, right? Like you have I think labor notes, this is their analogy, if I'm not mistaken. You have like the core kind of committee or organizers at the very center. You have kind of the people who will show up at a meeting and maybe in a next ring. And then you have a ring outside of that is like, those are the people who will, I don't know, put on a pin, like who will do some kind of token display of support.
Yeah.
And so you could ask the question, well, how big is each one of those rings? And the reality is the center ring is always very, very small.
Yeah.
And that's both a thing to be optimistic about, but it's also a thing that lets you know how fragile it is when companies start firing organizers for there to be sustained protest.
Yeah.
But before Maven, there was a pretty prominent case, fairly unique. You can find this reported in Bloomberg on the so-called Group of Nine. It was basically 9 senior engineers that, for various reasons, not like anti-war in many cases, just kind of from pure, I don't know, this isn't a good business decision, this isn't a good technical decision reasons, just refused to build an air gap product for Google Cloud that the Air Force wanted. Mm-hmm. And so it blocked this kind of core capability required for Google to start doing military cloud computing. And that was actually one of the impetuses for, the ability for Project Maven to even be successfully protested. It was like, hey, if only 9 engineers could get together and do this thing and shut it down, then what could, 50 to 100 people do? And so, obviously there are, weak points. Obviously, I'll quote it because literally every single Pentagon person does. They always try and describe things in terms of Star Wars in some way. And in fact, Mark Andreessen at one point, tried to pitch these Pentagon contractors as like the rebels, finding the exhaust port on the Death Star. Like, the exhaust ports do exist, like in software systems. There are kind of, not that I'm advocating this, but I think it's but I would also even kind of push back on the premise that, it's maybe overstepping a bit, because often there's very basic lack of information about what's going on. And so, for example, when I was at Google, a lot of what I learned about what the company was doing was actually through investigative journalism.
Yeah.
That may sound crazy, right? Like, you'd think the people in the company would know more than the journalists. But that's for controversial activities. It's often very few people in a company know what's going on because, the company knows it's controversial.
Yeah.
So actually kind of the relationship between journalists and employees at companies is really critical for people even to know that there's even something that they might oppose, um, or just want to understand better.
Yeah.
So I think like a prerequisite to any sort of broader activity is just transparency in these companies as to what's going on. And that may sound a bit like a punt, but I
No.
don't think
Yeah.
it's a punt. Like in practice, when there are long-term campaigns, to some degree, the fuel of those campaigns is the journalism exposing things.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, that was fantastic. I should let you go because I mean I could keep digging into all these areas, but yeah, no, it's quite a lot. I mean, obviously, what you're doing, the transparency is incredible. It sounded like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that you think there are. I like the analogy of the hole at the exhaust pipe or whatever. There's you would I'm sure maybe you would like to see more people in the tech industry, maybe younger people thinking about going into it, having an awareness through this transparency of the kind of tools that they're building. And, I don't know if a young kid just graduated from a university and he's going to work for Facebook or Google or Amazon or whatever, and he sees his ultimate boss sitting at the inauguration. Like, it's no secret anymore, right? Like the relationship, as you said, is no longer controversial, but there is if not a direct straight line, at least a pretty close connect the dots. And this is your job and your incredible work at Tech Inquiry to do it. Connect the dots of, the bomb that gets dropped in Gaza through the Who's Daddy program, connect the dots through the company or whatever. Like ultimately there's someone in that connected dots or several who are programmers working on stuff that if they decided to put their hands up and not touch another key, might break that chain and that pipeline a bit. And maybe if they start thinking of that a little bit, there's some hope. I don't know if that was too much, but
no, I mean,
yeah.
a really important like part of the debate that took place in these companies regarding that issue is what constitutes a contribution.
Right.
And
Jeez.
so basically, in the case of Maven, when the company Google was originally custom designing computer vision for the drone targeting, this is 2008. The company released a set of AI principles, which it just rolled back yesterday, in fact, saying we won't custom design artificial intelligence to cause harm.
Yeah.
But what they would do and what they did is sort of step back a bit and say, well, we'll sell you our cloud computing, but we're not going to build custom modifications of it for war. And that's kind of a funny moral stance because cloud computing is one of the most high profit margin, things you could ever sell. And so it's a bit convenient when the thing that's highly profitable is also sort of morally clean.
Yeah.
And so, but that, like, you have to understand that became the line in the sand.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, when the Google later signed the big CIA cloud contract, it effectively received no protest. And part of the reason, according to people I spoke to, was one, they were kind of worn out from protesting Maven and Jedi, but two, there was no custom designing. And so they felt it was kind of fine. And so I think to some degree today, even now, that's kind of the preferred attitude is to say, well, if you just, if you built something and you didn't know the DoD was a customer and then you later, found out they were a customer and you didn't change anything, then are your hands clean?
Yeah.
And most engineers have decided they are, which, is debatable.
Yeah. That's a fantastic place to end it. I think I'll try to handle some of the interesting philosophy there. I think that's probably intentional. If they sat you down, Jack, and was like, here's the program and there's a DoD, logo in the corner and here's the sample terrorist that you're going to drop a bomb on, you would know what you were doing. But if you're just like, oh, I'm just building this one little weird piece of the code that, I don't know, collects I don't know how any of this stuff works, so collects the northwest orientation of the sun at the moment, whatever the heck, like a little detail. And that, along with the other guy in the other cubicle, all adds up to this thing that then the DoD might just decide to stitch together and make a drone thing. Like, that's on them. Your hands are clean. You could sleep at night and look at yourself in the mirror. I think that's, there's an analogy there to maybe the greater philosophical question that we're all in, of what constitutes a contribution to any of this stuff. I mean, you named at least 8 companies that I probably interface with as a customer every day, right? Probably almost every one of my listeners. We're doing this on Zoom. That's probably one of them, for all I know. I use ChatGPT, Google, and it's like, how much is a contribution on my end of the consumer, giving my little bit of a data? It's an ethical question that you've landed on the lap of everyone in there.
I'll tell you my personal take on it. Why I left was just, I didn't feel comfortable, frankly, as someone who was like outside of work doing labor organizing, volunteering, to raise minimum wage and the like, to be getting rich off of what I saw as harming, broadly speaking, human rights. Like, I think obviously not everybody's getting rich, but a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And I think those people need to think really hard about, what their actual, goals are, and what kind of, like, to some degree, people get away with kind of remaining in lefty circles, despite looking the other way.
You can put a sign on your lawn that says the right message, and then do everything you want during the day. Yeah.
And it's delicate because on the one hand, you want to encourage like democracy at work, to use the term, or labor organizing at the companies. But I think part of the way that gets encouraged is not letting people kind of not be accountable to some degree for what their company is doing. And so there's a delicate dance when you're on the outside of like, how do you not shame people, but at the same time not like look the other way?
Yeah. I'm often trying to do that dance here on this show, or talk to people, and with myself, because it's a big deal. I love the dock worker analogy too. Refusing to put a missile on a tanker that is going to Israel, if you think that's a bad idea, is one thing. And there is a pretty direct analogy to that of the programmer passing along a 1 and a 0. It's obviously a much smaller contribution, but the principle remains. I'll let you go. Huge fan of your work. I know it was your encyclopedic knowledge of this stuff is insanely valuable. So just keep up the good work. Obviously, people can follow you. You do Twitter, Substack?
I don't have any. I have Substack.
Me too.
I mean, I don't have any other social media. I can barely even handle staying on Substack, but I found at least there I can primarily write, and I'd rather communicate carefully.
Yeah. Well, people should keep an eye on Tech Inquiry, and then look for you whenever you put something out. It's obviously carefully done and resourced really well. I'll link to the most relevant stuff, but thank you. You made me shit my pants several times, but then
well, that wasn't the goal, but hopefully it was informative, and I appreciate your time as well, Jay, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.